Hi there. We are on our study of the great ones, and this coming week we're going to be looking at chapter 10 of the Gospel of John. So if you've got your Bibles, turn there, John chapter 10. This is a chapter that a lot of people are familiar with because of the story of the Good Shepherd. Jesus is doing a teaching here, and he's talking about the idea of shepherding, and many people have read this over the years and they're very familiar with it. So, to give a proper context to John chapter 10, because it's a long chapter, it's 42 verses, to really understand it, we've got to look at the background and the context, the setting for which the story takes place. To really understand chapter 10, you have to go back and read starting in chapter 7. 7, 8, 9 are a lead in into chapter 10. It describes Jesus' teaching at what we would call the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths, and he is now in the city of Jerusalem. This is one of the major festivals of the Jewish people. It takes place in the Jewish month that falls in between September and October on the Jewish calendar. It never is the same. It just depends. It's sort of like a leap year setting, if you think of that. The Jewish calendar changes a little bit, but that would be the time period. So it's in the fall in the city of Jerusalem. And the feast is all about the Jews remembering the fact that God took care of them when they came out of Egypt. During their 40 years of wandering, getting ready to go into the promised land, they lived in little tents, if you will, little booths, is what they're called, or a tabernacle. So all the Jewish people sort of commemorate that by forming a little tent within their house or out in their yard in which they have a very festive time and reflect upon how God was able to take care of them. So with that as the backdrop, it's an important Jewish feast. All of the Jewish males would head towards Jerusalem to take part in this. If you look at chapter 7 and 8, Jesus has now come back to Jerusalem. The tension is we would say you could cut the tension with a knife. People, the Jewish leaders, are angry with Jesus because of his teaching and his miracles. He's claiming that he has authority from God. The people that are following Jesus are all excited. They see him as the coming Messiah. So we see this in chapter 7 and chapter 8, that there's some tension as Jesus is teaching. On his way out of the city, Jesus encounters a blind man and he heals him, and that's in John chapter 9. John chapter 9 is really tension filled because the Pharisees and the members of the Sanhedrin, they are trying to pin Jesus down, find out, are you really the Messiah? If he says he is, they feel that they can get him for blasphemy and that they would be able to carry out their plot to kill Jesus. So when he heals this man, they're really trying to find out who did this for this person. Why did he do it? And it puts the blind man and the blind man's parents on the spot because they're threatening them. The Pharisees are threatening to kick them out of service in the temple. They're trying to remove their Judaism from them if they're supporters of Jesus. So it's an interesting setup for chapter 10. Jesus is debating these religious leaders in chapter 9, and that debate continues throughout chapter 9 and the first half of chapter 10. It's an interesting time because we see Jesus really giving some clear teaching about him and the expectations that he has as God's representative here on earth. We see the resistance that the Pharisees set and the Sadducees, the scribes, and members of the Sanhedrin, their resistance to Jesus. And we see the people who are curious. They want to know about the Lord. And I think if you're one of Jesus's disciples, it's kind of a ping pong effect with your head. You're listening to the Pharisees, going back to Jesus, back to the Pharisees, back to Jesus. And it's very tense because the Pharisees have made up their mind. They're out to get Jesus. So chapters 7, 8, and 9, and the first half of 10 all fall into one narrative, if you will. It's like one long-running story and timeline. When chapter 10 opens, Jesus is still speaking to those critics. As chapter 9 ends, there's no natural break between the last couple verses of chapter 9 and chapter 10. So it's a continual narrative, so keep that thought in mind. He is attempting to explain truth to them, and they're very, very resistant to that. The first 21 verses or so of chapter 10 form one setting, and the last half of chapter 10 forms a completely different setting that actually takes place a few months later. But it's all together because there seems to be a theme about shepherding that ties both of those halves of John 10 together. So keep that thought in mind. There's really two different settings. One theme, it's about shepherding, and we're only going to focus on the first half of John chapter 10. In John 10, Jesus deals with three analogies, three stories, if you will, about shepherding. Shepherding is a theme that every Jewish person would have been familiar with. His entire audience understood this. In fact, at the temple, sheep are a common place event, seeing sheep, the sheep being sacrificed, etc. So shepherding was something they understood. So therefore, Jesus uses something they're familiar with to communicate truth. In the midst of his teaching and his discussion with the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees and this ruling council called the Sanhedrin, Jesus again uses a phrase. It's the I am phrase. Jesus says that I am the gate, and he says, I am the good shepherd. And when Jesus uses the term I am, it is a direct reference for the Jewish people there to reflect back to when Jehovah God gave his name to Moses and said, I am who I am. So when Jesus says, I am, he's identifying himself as God. The Jewish leaders understood that, and that's what made them so angry. So in the book of John, 7 times, Jesus uses that phrase, I am, I am, I am. You may remember, I am the way, the truth, and the life in John 14. But here, there's 2 different times Jesus uses that phrase. That's all part of this narrative, part of this story. He stakes a claim to divinity. The leaders are asking Jesus, are you the Messiah? Who do you say you are? And Jesus basically is telling them, I'm God. In fact, in the latter part of John 10, he comes flat out and says that. Now, months later, in the second half of John 10, he is again cornered by an aggressive mob of religious leaders who, again, are trying to pin Jesus down. Because if he says he's God, they're going to accuse him of blasphemy. If he says he's not God, then they really have nothing to worry about. And he again reflects back on the idea of shepherding. So 3 different stories in the first half of John 10 talk about shepherding. And then when he comes back to the temple several months later, he again uses the idea of shepherding. It's because it's in the same place, same location, same argument. Who are you? So when Jesus finishes John chapter 10, it sets up a big confrontation because in John chapter 11, Jesus does what many consider his greatest miracle, the raising of Lazarus from the dead, which he says is the defining statement about who he is, because only God can raise somebody from the dead. So with that in mind, we're going to kind of look at these 3 analogies, these 3 stories about shepherding from verse 1 through verse 21 of John 10. They're familiar to you and I. We've heard these stories before, but in reality, the average churchgoer has never really studied these 3 different stories that Jesus gives us. We're familiar with them, but we haven't thought about them. We haven't thought about their implication for our life, and we surely probably haven't thought very much about what did Jesus really mean when he made these statements. So in the first story, John chapter 10, verse 1 through 6, Jesus points out that sheep only listen to their owner, only listen to a particular shepherd. They won't listen to a stranger. And spiritually, the idea he's trying to get across is that people who care about God, who seek God, who have God's heart, seeking to know the Lord, and have God's heart as their own, they hear the messages of God. They listen to truth. And the Pharisees and scribes who are sitting there, they don't accept Jesus because Jesus said that the flock listens to their shepherd, and they obviously did not. Jesus is really pointing his finger at them, and he's accusing the religious leaders with the idea that you are not part of God's flock. So in this first story, John 10, 1 through 6, Jesus is really carrying on his debate that he's had in John chapter 9 with these men, and now the audience is listening, and he gives an analogy that they all understand. Sheep respond to their shepherd. And the idea of being a shepherd is throughout the Old Testament. The Jewish leaders were to be good shepherds, and they weren't. So Jesus is really saying, you are not part of God's flock. And this would have been a slap in their face, very subtle, but a slap in the face of the religious leaders, because they didn't hear the voice of their shepherd, who was God. They didn't listen to him. They set themselves up as false shepherds, Jesus says. Then there's the second story, and it's very brief, in verse 7 through 9 of chapter 10. It carries enormous, if you will, implications for our life. He talks about sheep pens. Sheep pens of that era out in the wilderness, if you're walking, might have been a small cave or even a depression in the ground in which the shepherd would put the sheep, would put some brush around it so animals couldn't get into it. But if you were to go into a village, there's a common sheepfold or a sheep pen, if you will, had high walls and usually a very narrow gate. And several shepherds might come to that town. They drive their sheep into that sheepfold, and they would spend the night as the shepherds would rest up some. There was only one way in and one way out. There could not be multiple ways because sheep would wander, and animals could come and kill the sheep, or people could come in one of the extra gates and take the sheep. So there was one gate in which the sheep could go in and come out. To control the access, there was a gatekeeper. Often in the wilderness, it would be the shepherd himself. In the communal sheepfold, there would be a gatekeeper who actually would sit in that very small doorway. So you can look at any door of your house and imagine sitting in that door or sleeping across the door. And the idea is this: no sheep could go out without touching the shepherd, and no animal or person could enter without violating his space. It was their way of having a security door, if you will, and it was the shepherd. As Jesus is teaching this, he says that he is the gate. He is the door, if you will. Nobody can enter in to the sheepfold unless they come through him. Jesus talked about that often. He is the one way that a person can get to God. Nobody else can get to God except going through him. People think, they hear that spiritual truth. They say that's very, very narrow. Christians are so narrow. Aren't there many ways to heaven? Well, if you think about the illustration Jesus has given us, there's only one way in that sheep pen and only one way out. That makes sense. Why couldn't God say the same thing and say there's one way into heaven, one way to me, and one way out? So that's the story that Jesus is telling here. He's trying to get them to see, the leaders of the Jewish leaders are not part of God's shepherding staff because they don't listen. They don't listen well. And then the second thing he says, I am the door, not you guys, I am. Then he gives them a third story in John 10, verse 10 through 18. So John chapter 10, verse 10 through 18. Now Jesus says he is the good shepherd. Direct contrast to all the Jewish leaders who he has called false shepherds and liars and thieves. They set themselves up to be practically worshiped by the common person. And Jesus says a shepherd is supposed to be kind. He's supposed to be compassionate. He's supposed to lead. He's supposed to protect. You don't do any of that. And there's many, many teachings throughout the Old Testament that talk about shepherds and the role that they have and how God's judgment comes upon false shepherds and bad shepherds. And he especially notes here his willingness to die. That sets him apart as the good shepherd from all wannabe shepherds. A good shepherd lays down his life for his flock, it says. for his sheep. You and I can relate to that because as parents, wouldn't we lay down our life for our children? We probably don't lay down our life for everybody that's out there, for those that we're committed to. And Jesus is committed to his people. He will lay down his life. Others just want the honor. They want the prestige. They want the benefits of being a wannabe shepherd. And Jesus in these three stories really it's like slap, slap, slap to the faces of the religious leaders in front of the common people. They must have been steaming at this point. I can see them very red cheeked as Jesus has just confronted them and put them in their place, if you will. Jesus here 2 times talks about the fact that I am the door or the gate and I am the good shepherd. Everybody sitting there as a Jewish person, when they hear the word I am followed by something, they would have understood the time when God said that to Moses. And it's an expression of deity. And Jesus is saying, I'm God, I'm God, I'm God. I'm God the shepherd, I'm God the door. Everybody sitting there got it. Okay, we have to understand the context. This is Jewish teaching to Jewish ears. So there's a lot of tension here. The crowd's listening to Jesus. They're trying to figure out the truths that he's teaching. They're watching the reaction of the Pharisees. I imagine they've gone pretty quiet at this point. When you look at John chapter 10, verse 19 through 21, to sum up those 3 stories, it really doesn't tell us how the debate ends. The debate we know is picked up 2 to 3 months later in the latter half of that chapter as Jesus goes out and then comes back in for a different festival, the Feast of Dedication. But that is the background to John chapter 10. It's talking to us about several things. Is Jesus really God? Without a doubt, he clearly is, to the Jewish mind, saying, yes, I am. It's telling us that there's one way to heaven, and the one way is through Jesus because he is the good shepherd. It tells us that you can be churched and you can be religious and still not belong to God's flock or the true believers who are going to heaven. There's a lot of truths here. Remember, Jesus is using parables. He's using analogies that totally make sense to the Jewish people of 2,000 years ago. So to read the story and just think a warm and fuzzy thought that, oh, Jesus likes little sheep isn't going far enough. We have to understand that he's in conflict with churched, we would say churched religious people who don't want to submit to the authority of God. They want power. They want control. To them, being religious is good enough. They didn't want Jesus. So that's what the background of this this chapter is all about. Now, as I read through the chapter a couple times this week, within chapter 10, verse 1 through 21, there were 7 themes that I saw. You could read this section of scripture, 21 verses, each day for 7 days. Each day, look at one theme. What does this passage tell us about this thought? The next day, read the 21 verses again and just focus on what does it say about this thought or this theme. Hopefully that makes sense to you. You have 7 themes. If you read the chapter, that half of the chapter, each day for 7 days, you could explore all 7 of these themes. And I think you'll learn a lot by doing that, especially now that you know the backdrop. The first theme is this. In verse 1 and other verses, it talks about the sheep pen or the sheepfold. What does that tell you? What can you research on Google? What pictures can you find that would show you what a sheep pen in Israel would look like and some of the teaching about it? I had a lot of fun doing that this week, looking at these 7 themes and identifying new ideas, new applications for my life. One of the things about a sheep pen is it protects you, okay? It keeps you in and keeps others out. So God is very protective of his people. That once we come into relationship with God, God protects us and provides for us while keeping those that would do us harm out and away from us. He does that for those who willingly enter the gate. So think of the sheep pen or the sheepfold. Second theme would be the scoundrels. Lisa came up with that word. The bad people that Jesus is talking about here. It talks about thieves. It talks about robbers. It talks about people who would do the sheep harm. So we just use the word scoundrels. As you read that and do a little research on these type of people back in the day of Jesus, you ask yourself, are there people like that today who would attempt to keep people from going into a relationship with God, or try to take them from a relationship with God and bring them to their own little religion or their own little set of beliefs? We call them false teachers. Paul, the apostle, talked about this multiple times, that in the church today, there are false teachers. They major on minor little issues. They want the glory. They want the attention. They want the focus. And they believe that they are the only right ones, and that you really don't need to listen to all of the Bible. So there are scoundrels today like there were scoundrels then. A third category is the shepherd, and Jesus talks about a person who is a shepherd, and he talks about himself as the good shepherd. Is there a difference between them? Pastors are called shepherds. Well, I don't make it, I would never tell anybody I'm the good shepherd. I try to be a good shepherd. Jesus said he is the one good shepherd. So what's the difference between Jesus, a pastor elder, and somebody who's a parent who is shepherding their children? Aren't there some similarities there? Jesus said a good shepherd lays down his life. He sacrifices, he serves for the benefit of the sheep. You can look at your life and say, how good a job are you doing at shepherding? The kids that you have at your home, the people at work, in your church ministry. Are you truly a shepherd, or are you a servant? Because the servant is the next category. There are people who are hired, depending on your version of the Bible. They're called hired hands. They're called servants. They're called watchmen. They're not the shepherd. They don't have that I will die for you commitment. They do it as long as it's convenient, as long as they're getting a paycheck, as long as people are noticing them. They'll serve, but they don't serve for the right motivation of love for the sheep and love for God himself. So you could look at the sheep pen, you could look at the scoundrels, you could look at the shepherd, good shepherd, you could look at the servants that are mentioned numerous times in these 21 verses. Then there's the sheep. I preached about the subject of sheep several months ago, so I won't go into that. We are all called sheep. And you got to do a little Google research, if you will. Why would God refer to you and I as sheep, both in the Old and the New Testament? What are the characteristics of a sheep? And how many of those characteristics are in your life? I think the more you understand about sheep, the more you understand about people who frequent churches. Next category is a category of salvation. In verse 9, it talks about being saved. And there's several other words and phrases that are used. What can you learn from this passage about salvation? When you get saved, are you saved forever, or can you lose your salvation? This whole chapter addresses the subject of eternal security. When you're saved forever. It's eternal. So what can you learn about the subject of salvation in the first 21 verses? Later in verse 27 through 30, it talks about the fact we are eternally secure. Our salvation is paid for and strictly under the authority of God. We have nothing to do with it. So you can learn a lot about the subject of salvation. In this section, verse 1 through 21, the last three verses, 19 through 21 actually, deal with the skeptics. And actually, remember, his whole teaching is towards the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees, and the ruling council of the Sanhedrin, the skeptics, as we call them. But we really see the skepticism in verse 19, 20, and 21. Why do people not take Jesus' word for it? Why would they resist him? They resist his miracles. They resist his teaching. They resist his character. Why do people not want to have Jesus as the shepherd of their life? You'll learn something if you read this text. 7 areas Read this section, verse 21 or verse 1 to 21, for 7 straight days. Each day, look at a different thought. The sheep pen or sheepfold, the scoundrels, the shepherd or good shepherd, the servants. Look at the difference between them. The idea that they're sheep, the idea of salvation, and the skeptics. You have 7 topics to study. Just do not read this passage one time and think you understand what Jesus is talking about. I've given you the backdrop, given you 7 topics to study. Hope you have a wonderful time. Love to hear any thoughts that you learn. All right. Hope you will apply this and do some reading this week. Take care.